Okay, everybody. Thanks for being with us tonight and joining us for Let's Talk Art. I'm Sarah Hall, Director of the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, and I'm joined by Daniel Fulco, our Agnita M. Stine Schreiber Curator. We do this, Daniel does this every other month, and usually he's partnered with someone from the museum. Sometimes we have guests. We talk about our exhibitions and collections, and we do keep this conversational, so we are happy to take questions in the chat. I will confess that we don't have a third person, so it's really hard for me to monitor the Facebook chat. If you're on Facebook, I will try. But those of you who have the Zoom link, it's easier for us to chat with you. And if you need a Zoom refresher, it's a webinar format. So you can ask or answer questions in the chat. You can raise your hand. You can adjust your screen view between gallery view or speaker view. Gallery view will show you both of us. Speaker view will just show you the one of us who's speaking, but it will bounce back and forth for sure. I know this is going to be a really fascinating dive into our current exhibition, Picasso on Paper. The artist is Printmaker, 1923 to 1972. But before we get started, since we have Picasso fans or folks interested in Picasso here with us, I wanted to let you know about a upcoming program that I am particularly excited about. We have invited our colleagues from the Brooklyn Museum to come to Hagerstown January 4th for a special conversation about their work organizing what was one of the most talked about exhibitions of the year, still this year. Earlier in 2023, the Brooklyn Museum had a show called It's Problematic, Picasso According to Hannah Gadsby. And their talk here in Hagerstown is going to be called Sorry, Not Sorry. It's Problematic at the Brooklyn Museum. And we have the curatorial team coming in that helped to organize that show. We have Lisa Small, the senior curator for European art, and Catherine Morris, the curator of the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum, joining us in Hagerstown on January 4th at 5:30. And one of the things that I find really exciting about this is it brings contemporary ideas into the museum. Daniel and I will no doubt talk about this a little bit, but in spite of his brilliance, his virtuosity, his artistic genius, Picasso is a problematic person. And, you know, we're living in a sort of revisionist era of trying to understand the past a bit differently. And it's hard when we impose our own values on the past. On the other hand, sometimes it's really necessary, I think, for us to make a sort of forward progress as people with a capital P who work and live together. So this exhibition, It's Problematic, was an attempt to look at Picasso and the 50th anniversary of his death, which was marked in 2023, as a project to examine his complicated legacy through a critical feminist lens. So I think it's going to be really interesting. I hope we get some people coming out and supporting conversations like this in Hagerstown. And I will say they spoke last week at the Picasso Symposium in Paris, and they're going to be speaking in Amsterdam. So I think being on a tour of Picasso, related to Picasso of Paris, Amsterdam, Hagerstown, I'm pretty proud of that. So come out and support us, please. And that said, I'm going to ask Daniel to say hello to everybody and start the screen share, and we'll have our conversation tonight, which may help you understand their conversation if you're able to join us.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. It's our great pleasure to share our insights with all of you about the Picasso on Paper exhibition, which has been fascinating to work on and curating the presentation at the Hagerstown Museum. So if you are able to, if you live in the area or if you're traveling, it's on view through next March of 2024 and is outstanding. This exhibition focuses on Picasso's printmaking exclusively. So you get a really outstanding opportunity to see prints that he made over a really long period of time. They're almost 50 years of his printmaking. And this is really amazing to see the variety and how Picasso changed over time. As a brief overview for you, he begins making prints as etchings, and we'll talk more about that tonight, And then he moves from etching into lithography, that is lithographs, followed by linocuts. And lastly, he returns to etching and engraving between the 60s and the early 70s, as Picasso died in 1973. So,
I'm just going to throw in a little
yeah,
context, which is, museums. I always describe a museum exhibition schedule as a jigsaw puzzle. We're working with an annual budget. We're working with trying to bring new things to town. We're trying to also complement and illuminate and maybe disrupt and cause some conversations around our own collection. And we're trying to bring in a variety of work. So we're not always looking at things through a European lens or a traditional art historical lens. We're trying to have diversity, inclusion of cultures, and also of materials, 2D, 3D, photography, painting. So it really is a puzzle we work out together. But when this exhibition proposal came across our desks, Daniel and I were quite excited because we do have a couple of Picasso prints in the collection, including a really spectacular example of his lino cut technique. And it really felt like a fun way to engage our community in a larger look at Picasso's work, and just was coincidentally during that 50th anniversary year of his death when Picasso was getting a sort of renewed sense of attention.
exactly, sir. And it also builds on we have presented Picasso's work in the past. In 1972, we had an exhibition of his ceramics. In addition to being a printmaker, Picasso, of course, he's a painter, he's a sculptor, but he also made ceramics, a medium he discovered in southern France, beginning in the 1940s, and then he really took off for him in the 50s. So we're building upon something that was done, but it was 51 years ago. So we're really excited to have Picasso back in the galleries after so long. What a special opportunity.
And we talked a lot, we have sort of strategy meetings, and we talked a lot about, what does Picasso mean to people today? And I think there's the number one thing is name recognition. And then, for some people, there is that complicated legacy. And for others, they know the name and they don't even really know when he lived. So I will confess, we added the dates to the exhibition title because we wanted people to understand his key role in the 20th century as being a hugely influential artist, throughout almost the entire century.
Exactly. He was a pioneer in so many ways, as you'll discover with us this evening. The works are drawn from the Timothy Collins collection, and Timothy Collins is shown in this photograph on the left. This is Eric Morleau, an art dealer who helped to sell Timothy Collins the prints that you will see in the exhibition. So they're derived entirely from Collins' collection. And Eric Morleau is the grandson of Fernand Morleau, about whom we'll speak tonight. Fernand Morleau was a printmaker. He ran a printmaking workshop and collaborated with Picasso on his lithographs. So there's a very interesting connection here with the art dealer and the collector. And in these two photographs, you see Picasso as he loved to be portrayed, immersed in his work, which here you actually have, I believe this looks to me like an etching, or it's a lithograph. Actually, I think that looks more like a litho. And he's showing you the matrix. Probably it is a zinc plate. And then you have the actual image, which is, of course, the inverse of it. And then in the background, look at all these canvases. He was so prolific, Picasso. He produced somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40,000 artworks, I believe, over his nearly 80-year career. It's unbelievable.
It is amazing, and we're saying what 2,400 of them probably about were prints. I'm just going to say, we're talking about the reversal of the printmaking process, and we had a kind of funny conversation last week. We were taking a group of benefactors through the exhibition, and we were talking about that reversal of printmaking and how it can be tricky for an artist if you're envisioning what the final product will look like. And I said, it didn't seem like to me like Picasso really cared about that aspect is that much, because in most of the prints, his signature and date, often very specific date, is backwards. So he's just putting it on the plate the way it is, and then we're seeing it in the print in reverse.
Exactly. And he was really precise. He would date it the exact day. And he would tell us sometimes if he did more than one in one day. It depends on which image we're looking at, which work. Here he is. He's making some final brush touches to one of his linocuts, and this one looks like it has to do with the bullfighting motif, or it's a rider on horseback with perhaps some kind of an animal. And then look at the background. There's a huge sculpture. Looks like it's made of perhaps marble. So he collected all kinds of things in his studio. Here you're seeing him in southern France, where he retired, so to speak, where he stayed for the rest of his life. Though Picasso actually never really went into a full retirement. When he's at this age, he's a celebrity artist. He's quite wealthy and he does as he wishes. And you and I talked about this, Sarah, that with Picasso, especially as time went on in his career, he was interested in the entrepreneurial aspects, and printmaking drives his desire to, in some form, commercialize his work. Is that right?
Sure.
Yeah.
You can be available to a larger portion of the market because prints are available in multiples. So you're reaching people with a little less economic ability. I don't know that Picasso was ever completely affordable. I don't think you could say middle class necessarily, but it expands his market and allows him to be even more dominant. That quote that I keep using, one of the printmakers he collaborated with said something, and Daniel may have the exact quote, but if he were going to make shoes, he would want to make the most shoes. I mean, he's incredibly driven, and this hours and hours in the studio and just making and making is really just part of his ethos. But I love that you put these images in, because one of the questions we get a lot related to prints is, well, how are they Picassos? Like, how much of Picasso is actually in this print and how much of it is a reproduction? Well, as opposed to a reproductive print, he's always working the matrix for these, whether the matrix is a stone for lithography or a linoleum block for a lino cut or a plate, a copper or zinc plate for an etching. It's Picasso who is working the matrix. He is making the image. He's collaborating with printmakers on the actual editioning of his prints, which can be a pretty labor-intensive, complicated process. But they're Picassos. They're just Picassos that are able to be produced in multiples. And I'm going to get all my favorite quotes out of here early in the talk. But the other thing I love is that he talks about how early on, there's this immediacy involved in printmaking and its connection to draftsmanship. And he says, he wanted to capture his thoughts. Later on, printmaking was about capturing the way his thoughts moved. And I think that's really a wonderful thought, I think, for anyone. Let's think about how our thought moves from this to this and what's happening in between. But printmaking, because it allows you to edition and to keep alterations as you change an image and document them, it's a really great description of what printmaking can be used for.
Exactly. Yes. And I was able, Sarah, to pull up that quote. This was something that was described by the printmaker Jacques Frelot, who collaborated with Picasso and became head of Roger Lacouriere's studio in Paris. He said in the early 60s, quote unquote, Picasso needed to have command of his medium, to tame it. He was a brawler. He was always a competitor. As Picasso had said, as Sarah mentioned, if I'd been a shoemaker, he once said to me, I'd have wanted to be the one who made the largest number of shoes. So Picasso really was always working with it, in some regards, grappling with the printmaking process, working out the challenges of it, and pushing the boundaries. And we do have some more quotes that we'll share later as we go through these phases of his output. Here are some installation shots. As with every exhibition, it takes a great deal of planning, from preliminary discussions about the overall concept of the exhibition to creating layouts, which are completed by our colleague, manager of collections and exhibitions, Sarah Wolf, to physically installing the exhibition and, of course, preparing the curatorial interpretation. And this is really something that is part of the behind the scenes. So to get to
And
this,
yeah, I think if in your head you think of print shows as being small scale, intimate. I mean, these are intimate, but they're much larger scale than what many print shows are displaying. And of course, there's a variety of frames, which makes an installation look a lot more interesting than when everything's in the same travel frame. And we painted for it. So we did a lot of thinking about how to present this exhibition so that people would enjoy it, and we give the visitors the best experience we could.
yes. If you come and you begins in our bio gallery, you will also see um, panel interpretation and also a case showing you the different tools, particularly used to make etchings and lino cuts. And then in the Bowman Gallery, we present the lithographs that he made with Morlot, a collaboration. So the show starts, as you're going to see tonight, in the 1920s with the etchings. You go into the Bowman Gallery, you'll see the lithographs that he made with Morlot. And when you proceed into the Kirstein Gallery, the third gallery, you'll see primarily in their lino cuts, but also etchings and engravings on this wall over here from his late career.
And I'll just say that I love that henna colored wall, and I wish we'd used more of it. You can document that. It's pretty. Yeah.
It is pretty, yes. It's a very nice color combination. When you come, be sure to grab also the glossary rack card, which includes important terms about the different kinds of prints and the tools used to make them. The gallery guide offers you an overview of Picasso's career. It tells you about the women in his life, his various partners who are shown there. We're going to talk more about them this evening. And then a very helpful timeline, providing you artistic, cultural, and historical context about the artist. So let's jump into it. Of course, as many of you know, Picasso is Spanish. He was born in Malaga, Spain, which is in the south of the country. He spends time in Spain. He trains. His father was an artist, but he yearns to go to Paris, which was the center of a newly growing modern art movement in the early 1900s. He arrives in Paris in about 1900, and he makes it his new home and goes back and forth between Paris and the south of France. Oh, it looks like we have a question there, Sarah, from
Okay.
Marie.
Let me find Marie. Marie, I could allow you to talk if you want to ask a question, or you could type it in the chat. Giving a moment here. Looks like she's able to talk now if she wants to. I'm not hearing. Marie, we can't hear you. I think the best thing might be for you to go ahead and type the question in the chat if you have a question or comment, and I'll check that. I'm hoping that we can connect with you and share your observations. Okay, well, I guess we'll go back, and if she drops a question in the chat, we'll circle back to it.
No problem. As Sarah was mentioning earlier, we connect this exhibition to works in our collection, particularly this beautiful lino cut called the Grand Nude de Femme. And it's made in multiple colors. And one thing that Picasso did, and we'll show you with the other lino cuts afterwards, is with printer Hidalgo Arnera, with whom he collaborated in the south of France, a printmaker. It worked out a new method, he and Picasso, whereby they used a single linoleum block, but would color it with multicolored inks. Previously, when artists would make lino cuts, they often had to make an individual linoleum cut block for each image. But what Arnera suggests to Picasso, and Picasso works out, is this method for re-inking the linoleum block so that he could create an image like you see here.
it's called a reduction process, right? Reduction linoleum block
Yes.
printing. And I think essentially you have to really, as an artist, there's an incredible amount of deliberation involved because you're working from light to dark, right? You're going to print darker colors over lighter colors. And of course, as always, when you're printing it multiple times, registration is really important. Everything has to line up perfectly. But you would start with the lighter colors and then carve some more into the block. And of course, that's the thing too, is if you're carving, you have to start with the least amount of detail and move to the most amount of detail while you're also moving from light color to dark color. And there is, I think, I hate being in this position, but was it Harvard Art Museums that did a really wonderful demo? I think their conservator
Yes.
does a few stages of this. So if you're really interested, you can go on YouTube and watch the reduction lino cut process in action. It's like a 15-minute video and it's really fascinating.
It is indeed. And when you come to the museum, you will come and here's the lobby and the entrance. We have these works by Picasso and his contemporaries that are displayed right outside the start to the exhibition. So you can see this line cut. And it really makes great impact in which Picasso is trying to show the motion of this woman. Likely his partner at that time and wife, Jacqueline Roch, and if not exactly her, inspired by her, shown in two um, view vantage points, if you will. And she almost has two faces, as if they
Right.
were reflected.
Well, it is, I was in the galleries today, and it is always interesting to listen to people visiting. And it's a Picasso that looks like a Picasso, right? So it's a fairly large scale print. It's really dramatic. And it is, if you have associations with Picasso related to cubism and sort of the geometric breakdown of the body, this looks like a Picasso. And the folks in the gallery were looking at the dove, and I don't know if we're going to talk about the dove later, but they were looking at that saying, this doesn't look like a Picasso to me. And so it's interesting the associations people have in their minds.
Yes. And this one also may not necessarily be characteristically Picasso upon first observation, but it's also in our collection, a gift of our benefactors, Mindy and James Marston. And it depicts Alex Magui, who is one of Picasso's art dealers. And Picasso used this as a poster image to advertise a show of his paintings in Mougins, France, which is near Antibes in the south.
We'll do a little museum education here for folks too who may not be familiar. If you looked down at our credit line where it says gift of Melinda and James Marsden, there's our accession number, 2015.13.1, which means it is the 13th gift we received in the year 2015. And the Marsdens may have only given us that one gift, or they may have given more. That's what the 0.1 stands for. But I'm just saying that we've had it for us several years in the collection. They are wonderful friends of the museum, and I think her sister gave it to her as a gift when she was a college student. I'm sure we have that documented in the file, but it's just a lovely personal story that goes along with having this print in our collection.
Yes. As I recall, I think it may have been a wedding present. And it was originally purchased at Ferdinand Roten Galleries in Baltimore, which was a very good art gallery in the city. So we're very pleased to be able to bring these out. Previously, Alex Magui was not displayed, but what a perfect chance to connect it to the show. Other works and artists who are definitely connected to Picasso include Paul Cézanne, though this is very early. Cézanne influences Picasso in terms of breaking down the pictorial space into geometric shapes, which leads to cubism. We also have Henri Matisse, his elder colleague and rival, but they were also friends. He influences Picasso, as you're going to see. Then Fernand Léger, who was more drawn to rounded figures and realism, but dealt with also figures from the circus, a very interesting artist too.
Yeah, people have a lot of fun when we bring things out of storage, and of course works on paper are meant to be in storage about 75% of the time to prevent fading. So it's fun to bring them out.
It's fabulous. The Georges Braque that you see here, homage to J.S. Bach, as Braque was also a musician. He loved J.S. Bach's music. And he and Braque together, that is Picasso and Braque, develop this cubist style. And here in this period, because we don't have a print or piece in the exhibition, this helps to show visitors where did Picasso begin when he was creating cubism with his colleague Braque. And you get to see that with our etching here, which is based upon the painting in the MoMA in New York, shown in the center. And then this is a comparison, is one of Picasso's famous paintings called Man with Violin in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And, Sarah, I talked about this in this period, Picasso and Braque, the work is sometimes indistinguishable in certain regards.
And it's a very, cubism is incredibly deliberate, right? For people who think artists are, swayed by their emotions and they're, kind of spilling their guts out on canvas all the time, which of course Picasso does do in a kind of enigmatic way. But it's not particular. It's very synthetic, right? It's a created approach to image making that comes out of conversation, deliberation, intellectualism, all sorts of things conflicting and converging together in that period of time. It's a very deliberate thing.
Yes, and it really contrasts with some earlier periods that Picasso worked in. This is among his earliest etchings, called the Frugal Repast, which is part of it's connected to his blue period, not represented in the show, but just showing you he starts out with a printmaker at the studio called the Bateau Lavoir. And his name was Eugène Delattre. These are depictions of people who are part of bohemian culture and life in Paris, in which Picasso was immersed at the time. This is a gorgeous picture in the Cleveland Museum of Art called La Vie, or Life.
It's interesting to me, and we talked about this internally when we were planning for this show, the cultural ubiquity of Picasso without a lot of understanding. So I'm sure there are tons of people who know that there was a blue period and a rose period, but don't know anything about the blue period or the rose period other than, there are these references to those times in Picasso's oeuvre. It's really interesting. So hopefully between this exhibition that really focuses on the prints and the nice contextualizing you've done in the gallery guide, people leave with a little better understanding.
Yes. And that leads us into the very different print that he did much earlier, which, by the way, I should say in the early 1900s with the Frugal Repast, he was just sort of experimenting with it. Our show begins in the 20s when he started out with Eugène Faure, and then he moves over to a couple of other printmakers, Charlot Frere and Edmond Desjobert. He starts to say, I really want to focus in on this. And when he does the dry point and etchings, and then also he does lithographs, at the time, he settles on etching as his primary medium. And at that time, he had met and was married to Olga Koklova, his first wife, who was a ballet dancer with the Ballet Russe, which is very closely associated with the choreographer Sergei Diaghilev in Paris. And with Olga, they have a child. This is the beginning of also Picasso's frictions and the difficulty that he brings upon the women in his life. Not that he hadn't before then either.
I was going to ask you, Daniel,
Sure.
and this went in and out of my head back when we were looking at the Alex McGee print. So when, you're the person who really dipped into all of the academic scholarly research for this show. And I remember you coming to my office and saying, I think we should organize this by Printmaker, which of course creates a chronology anyway, because he worked with different printmakers at different stages in his life. But I'm wondering, how much did you learn? Because I was so delighted when I went out and I looked and I saw the printmakers identified on our prints that we own, matching up with those in the show. And I thought, well, this is probably an example of, the exhibition work helping us understand our collection better. But, maybe you knew all that before this show. I don't know.
I did not, Sarah. My background of Picasso was the greatest hits. The Demoiselle d'Avignon painting that I showed before, moving up to Guernica, and then, Girl Before a Mirror, from 1932. So it was basically Picasso very quick as a student, at undergrad. And then we didn't really study him at all in grad school because we get more specialized in whatever area we're going into. So I learned a lot, and I got to dig into the prints, because usually the prints, I will say, you may have discovered this too, they're kind of marginalized. They're not integrated into his story.
Right. Oh, wait, I mean, and it's that way in museum collections often too. I often talk, when we're talking about collections management issues, people don't always document, photograph, drawings and watercolors and works on paper with the kind of specificity they do paintings. And hopefully we're all getting better at that as time goes by. But yeah, it can be frustrating sometimes.
In
That
these
little
early,
la lecture, the reading, I will say, it is one that I find really appealing, and it's very strangely, it evokes kind of 18th century France, and in a way for me, the posture of the little boy, his costuming, but it's completely modern, and it's the way it's been executed. It's really interesting to me.
I find it interesting too, when I was looking through various books, both in our library and that I checked out from other libraries. This is actually it's a very unique style, and it's quite different. This is from 1926, from the two women looking at a nude model from just 3 years earlier, which is arguably classicizing part of his classical style. And when you go to the next slide, Three Musicians is totally cubist from 1921. So in this period between the end of World War I, when he comes out of the synthetic cubism period that we looked at earlier, he's all over the place. And here you have from 1922, just a year later, look at Women Running on the Beach, Dinar, summer 1922. It's so different. These almost sculptural figures.
It's fun. We've had our docents and volunteers and various people associated with the museum, I will say, have had fun. Because Picasso lived until 1973, there are film interviews, lots of documentation related to him. People have had a good time going on and watching some of his drawing demonstrations online. So something you might want to do if you're interested, anybody who's listening.
Yes, I agree, Sarah. I watched a couple documentaries and also some other videos, and I love seeing him interviewed, because a lot of the films were done beginning in the 60s, and to just see him working, and then working on his copper plates,
And
particularly.
sometimes he doesn't have a shirt on.
Sometimes that's right.
That's kind of a little leitmotif of Picasso, right? Maybe we'll talk about that more later.
Yes. And of course, as we had mentioned, and I'm sure it will be discussed, Sarah, at the talk about the problematic exhibition from the Brooklyn Museum, Picasso is, in terms of his relationships with women, he is abusive, he is sporadic, he's downright mean, and he's very creative, but he is also destructive, particularly in a period between the early 30s and going through World War II, as it was a time of great turmoil in Europe. No excuse for his behavior, but this manifests itself in a lot of his work. And we encourage you to also go to get books out, to look on the web, to see the other kinds of prints he did. The ones in this show are not particularly violent, but some of his prints get very violent, with sexual imagery or fighting figures. And then some are very dreamy and calm. And this reflects his personality. He would be very focused. He worked from day to night. As he said, he lived to work. And this was at the expense of people whom he loved, such as Marie-Thérèse Walter, who was shown in this photograph.
I was interviewed this afternoon by a local journalist, and I think the way I put it was, generous people describe him as a misogynist, and others describe him, as actually abusive and certainly psychologically abusive. But I think there was instances of him, locking women in rooms. I think there were instances I've heard of, cigarette burns. So, these are problematic, and more than problematic. I think he is, in some ways, this model, thank goodness, of this, sort of machismo, this big, huge creative ego that is allowed to kind of flatten everything in its wake. I think maybe we've put that to rest, or we'd like to think we've evolved beyond that. But he is a huge example of that kind of behavior.
He is indeed. And here we may argue that he is represented by the Minotaur, a mythical beast described in Greek mythology, who was the offspring of King Minos. And the Minotaur for artists contemporaries of Picasso, particularly the Surrealist, was one of unbridled passion, eroticism. For Picasso, it's sort of a symbol of power and domination. And Picasso, as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, his ego is it's injected, if you will. It's inserted in so much of his work. So Picasso, he's always there in some form, whether it's the Minotaur, or maybe it's a mythical beast like a faun or a centaur, or a classical sculpture, a head, like this Greek man with a glass toasting. And it's over Marie Therese, who's dreaming of metamorphoses. She's having a dream. And you have all of these figures who are appearing in that dream in this really outstanding etching from his Volar suite, which is an outstanding series that was published by his dealer, Ambroise Vollard. It was shown there in a photograph by Bresson, also Picasso's friend. And it's at this time that Picasso collaborates with a man named Roger Lacourière, who's pictured on the right here. And Lacourière does a lot to introduce Picasso and show him what are the possibilities of printmaking. I should mention Marie Therese, when he met her, she was only 17 years old. She was so young. And in these works, she shows up in many different forms. We're going to take you through, you could see a couple of other examples in the show that are from the Volar suite. It's one of his most famous. They're outstanding images with contrasts in light and dark, aspects of classicism emerging, the arrangement of different female nudes. And then you have some that are very simply drawn. They almost look like drawings, individual drawings, but they're prints.
I was going to say, I went through, so, during the installation process, at some point I went through and kind of, we do lots of advanced planning, but there are always changes that we make when we see the actual work in the space. And so I went through to sort of look at the installation and give my recommendations, but also to be able to talk to people about the show, to have the firsthand experience with it. And one of the things, I'm looking at my notes from my very first visit to the galleries, and you feel, his power kind of, leaps off the walls at you. It's a very graphically powerful show. And one of the things I wrote is there's this, sometimes there's this great delicacy, which you're seeing in that print you just showed. And sometimes there's a real brutality, like you feel this energy that even if the subject matter isn't necessarily violent, you were referring to that, it's full of this kind of forcefulness that I felt, was kind of a brutality.
Yes, particularly as we're going to see, Sarah, when we go to the lithographs of the bullfighting scenes. Those are that kind of almost attacking the matrix and then ultimately the print.
And I should say, for anybody who's on here who doesn't hear art speak a lot, a matrix is what he's working as a printmaker. So it could be a metal plate, it could be a lithographic stone, it could be a piece of linoleum for a lino cut, but that's called the matrix.
And speaking of it, there's one in the exhibition from 1948, and this is one of his copper plates for a woman in or at Chignon, based on the Renaissance Spanish poet Góngora, for this poem that the Spanish author wrote. But what Picasso did is he invented a series of portraits of beautiful women. The image that you see here is not related to the poems, but the whole work, it was an illustration for it, it does have poetry in it. But you can see there the plate is canceled so that more impressions cannot be made.
But they do that sometimes. You'll get one and it's it's an impression made from a canceled plate that somebody restruck the plate, because you get those lines across it, because sometimes an artist is so notable, people just take liberties because they want more. But yes, that's meant to prevent further images, and it's fun to see these together, because you see very clearly the way the print process gives you a reverse image.
Picasso also, his studio is also put into the work. It emerges in it. So here you have a head of a woman. This is actually based off of his impressions of Marie Therese. And then that sculpture finds its way into the Volar suite. So it's all Picasso's surroundings as well. And what a contrast, as we were talking about. This is so calm. It's so serene.
Oh, it's like a master class in contour drawing. It's beautiful and elegant. Yeah.
And very different from this one up here. This one isn't really more, I wouldn't say violent, but it is certainly more dramatic with the contrast of light and dark. It's a totally different approach.
He's doing a lot with the shading of the figures and the positioning of the figures, just and creating a sort of depth in the space with that lurking male face in the background.
Yes. And Picasso is looking for inspiration from classical art. He sees works on view in various museums, particularly when he went to Italy. That's where he met Olga Koklova in 1918 and married her. So it was in Rome, actually, he sees these pieces. He also goes to Pompeii, and he becomes fascinated by classical art. Not only the line drawing, but the painting on Greek ceramics. So stunning.
Well, and you can see, if you imagine those as not having, sort of solid color and just being contour drawings, you can see the relationship very clearly to the print we were just looking at, that kind of curvaceous voluptuousness of that contour line.
That's right. And you see that here. This is in the exhibition too, as is this one called Lysistrata, which is a Greek play. And that kind of delicacy of the line drawings. These are just so beautiful. He did, within the Volar suite, he did so many of them. This being the Volar suite, this is separate. This was an illustration for an illustrated edition of Lysistrata. And Picasso was a great illustrator. He did numerous books and collaborated with printers and publishers. It was an important sideline to his overall work. Now here we come to Dora Maar. And Dora Maar is among the most tragic, in terms of the story and their relationship, the most tragic, because
I know at least someone who's listening with us who did a gallery talk on Dora Maar back at my previous place. So we may have a semi-Dora Maar expert on the call with us. We'll see.
Yes, but she was driven into, in terms of her tension with Picasso, and the explosiveness of the relationship, into a nervous breakdown that resulted in her hospitalization It was very sad.
She was amazingly talented in her own right, and I think she recently had a retrospective at the Pompidou Center. She was considered a muse for Man Ray. I think she shared a darkroom space with Brassai, so she's in the thick of it. This idea, there are women, in Merit Oppenheim. There are women amongst this group of men working at the time. And in fact, we have a program coming up in February called More Than Muses, where we kind of take, in response to Picasso, we make women a 3-day focus of what we're doing. But yeah, Dora Maar, she also, well, you have Guernica there. She's known for taking the photographs of the process of that. She was a photographer. Amazing advertising work that she did. Really, edgy even today, and compelling, and sometimes quite funny. So I kind of personally feel slightly heartbroken at the sort of tumult and the lack of realized potential that might have happened because of the destructiveness of her relationship with Picasso. And it's hard to measure that, though. How much is fueling creativity and how much of it is breaking someone down. It's hard to know.
In terms of the friction that they had, you can see that in his painting The Weeping Woman. And this is what's so strange about Picasso, difficult to reconcile, is this abusive relationship and how Picasso reacts to it. He shows her crying and beginning with the oil painting, but he does a series of prints called The Weeping Woman, 1, 2, and so forth. And they're very powerful images. These are not in the exhibition, but I bring them in to show you that some of these, they get very emotional and more violent. And their relationship really is very strained. Of course, Picasso had, he at the same time he meets Dora Maar, he was still technically with Marie Therese. So,
and then Francois Gillot comes along. I will say, I was talking to Daniel before we came online that I rewatched the Anthony Hopkins movie, and I can't even remember what it was called. But Julianne Moore plays Dora Maar in that. It's kind of interesting.
Yes. And then he meets Francoise Gillot, whom he does not marry. And you have him trying to deal and work out in this print that's in the show. Two nude women from 1946. Here you have Francoise, and then Dora Maar's in the background reclining on a bed or a couch. So you have the two women, the two relationships surfacing in the works themselves.
I've been known to say over the last few weeks, as we've been living with Picasso in our midst, that he spends his time in his head, right? And this comes, I might be saying this out in the wrong place in our talk, but we had someone ask us, he moved to the south of France. Was he there because of the light? All these artists in the south of France are there because of the light. And my personal gut reaction to that was, he's there because it's beautiful and it's warm. It reminds him of Spain, and he can run around without a shirt on and have his menagerie of animals. But when he's in the studio, he is in his head. And he's not interested in landscape. He's not interested in capturing fleeting moments. He's responding to art history. He's creating these personal mythologies. There's a lot of, allegory and symbolism. It's all, he's a big part of his own subject matter, even when he's in conversation with art history or classical motifs. It's really in his head.
That's right. And that plays out in terms of his process too, where he's frantically and constantly working. The 40s were a turbulent time for him. It starts to calm down a little bit, if you will, by the late 40s in terms of more violent subjects. And definitely you can get into the early 50s. But this almost cinematic quality to his creation of states. And that by that, what we mean is a reworking of the original image that's made on the matrix to create different prints or impressions. And Picasso worked through numerous states. and did lots of handwork. So it begins this composition much more realistically. You can see that here.
She almost looks like a Barbie doll or something.
I know. And then as time goes on, it starts to become more and more abstract. And look what happens once you get to this date, 17. These are only a selection. It's getting more cubist. And then here's the one that's in the exhibition, which is sort of in between them. I think it's number 6. So he was working through numerous states. Here's Francoise again in a series of a head of a young girl. And then he ends it with head of a stylized woman, which shows the influence of Henri Matisse's lino cuts from just 5 years earlier. I should mention that Picasso now, in the mid-40s, in 1945, he begins a collaboration with Fernand Merlot. And that's Merlot's studio there in creating lithographs. So he goes through these different phases. And lithography occupies his attention through, almost the early 60s. And he's sort of overlapping with lino cut at that time. He does works like this that are, again, as Sarah was saying, it's in his head. These are just fantasies, Centaur and Bacchante.
Although he does say, there's that wonderful quote you have on one of the labels, and I've mentioned this in numerous various public programs at the museum, that one of the things I think that Daniel did a nice job with for this exhibition is that a lot of the labels end with a quote, either by someone who worked with Picasso or by Picasso himself, that really gives a sense of immediacy and voice to being in the room with these prints. And one of the Picasso quotes is something like, I'm not sure what's going on, but when I'm down south, when I'm in the South, centaurs and fawns start showing up in my work. It's like they live there. So that southern environment, that evocative of Spain, or maybe evocative of the Campagna in Rome, the Roman countryside. It brings to life for his imagination these creatures. That's kind of one of the more fun and kind of endearing quotes in the exhibition. I can't say there's a lot about Picasso that I would use the word endearing to describe, but that is.
Yes, he really does a number of series of these dealing with the mythical creatures of Greco-Roman antiquity. And here's actually Françoise Gillot reclining amidst these figures, and so she's pulled into this fantastical image. The technique that he was using for his etchings was something called the sugar lift etching. The lithographs, you have some of this handwork in terms of the brushwork, but with the etchings that we were showing you before, he created what was called sugar lift, in which Picasso would go back and actually brush like a painting or watercolor onto the copper plates. So the printmakers like Le Courrier, and then also working with Merlot, they teach him a lot about how he could be, really creative.
Well, and he's very unconventional, right? He tries things that don't always work, and he's putting stuff on the plates that maybe shouldn't be on the plates. But it's sort of tireless experimentation that sometimes yields really fantastic results, and sometimes yields failure. But I know he was known for like pouring gasoline on plates. You have an image somewhere in here of him rinsing plates in the shower.
Yes, we'll very shortly get to it. The more violent, if you want to call them, the prints are the bullfighting or the Grande Corrida series. Here we have one called Le Picador, which is one of the actors or participants in a bullfight who uses a pike to torment the bull, to weaken it, mounted on horseback. And then you have the matadors who are down below, who are standing and performing their function. There's a photograph of Picasso with actually Roger Lacourière, I believe, on the right here at the arena. And since he was a kid, Picasso, he'd go with his father in Spain to the bullfights. And so he becomes sometimes almost obsessed with them.
And it's bullfight posters, right, that introduce him to the lino cut process, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. So this way of reproducing imagery that's maybe relatively simple and straightforward, he starts adopting. But we're still looking at lithos here.
These are just so energetic. I think they're some of the most emotionally driving works in the show. When they first arrived, I was amazed by them and the size, the impact of them.
They're
Because
very, I mean, we had trouble with that wall because
yeah,
they are a set of 4 and they're quite monumental. And getting that wall to feel right with all of them on it, too large to double hang. We messed around. I think it works now. But it
it
wasn't.
does.
Yeah.
But you get to see the progression in the different states here, of the chiaroscuro, that is the contrast between the light and the dark. You can see the arena, you see the picador here, the matador, but all the figures almost are clumped together. And Picasso does this deliberately to recreate the emotion and the energy of such an event. I've never
You
gone to.
have one, I'm wondering, where you can kind of enlarge it and show that the crowd, it's almost comedic, the way he gets the replication of faces in the crowd with this kind of zigzagging line going on in there.
See
We
that?
see it. Yeah, those lines that delineate the faces. And there is this sense of, barely controlled chaos happening.
It's almost as if the architecture in the sky and the clouds in the background, they're pulled with it like a wind. They're just amazing these. And then when he comes to this third final state, he darkens it even more. Just remarkable. Now, I do see that we're going on 7. I want to make sure that we get to.
Yeah, go through fast and we'll see what other things. I will say, come see the show. If you're nearby, even within an hour, we're saying if you're within an hour, you should be coming to see our exhibitions. It's up until March 3rd. And it's the Sorry Not Sorry. The Brooklyn curators are coming on January 4th. So that would be a fun evening to join us for. Yeah, this is a really, really striking lithograph, and it's so interesting to see it with the other states too, because you might assume this one has color and a lot of detail, a lot more detail than some of the others. So you might assume it's a later state, but actually he's taking away things from, so he's choosing not to print in color and he's choosing to minimize some of the detail in the later states. So it's really fascinating. And then he's also, the sort of sense of African influence, it kind of increases the patterning and the geometry. It's a really interesting series.
They're fabulous. These are the ones that we have on exhibit. It ends up at this one here. It starts here when you come to see it. With, as Sarah was saying, with the coloring, and he's experimenting with that. An Orientalist subject of the odalisque. These are very early states. Look at how it's like a sketch.
And he's using the single color in some of them, and it's interesting to see that the way the architectural setting sort of comes and goes. Sometimes he's really interested in evoking the space, and sometimes he's not interested at all. Sometimes he's more interested in the way the figures fit together and the relationship that's happening with them. It is quite fascinating.
He did do posters as we had mentioned, to promote his work. And sort
I
of
love that little guy on the left. He smiles at me every time I come into the gallery.
That's right. And it's in Valoris that Picasso is introduced by a German colleague to linocut. He makes a suggestion, have you experimented before with linocut? And these are just some of the other etchings. David and Bathsheba, you should not miss this one when you come to the show. The biblical subject from the Old Testament. It's fabulous. This is the 6th state. It's on view in the gallery. And he's looking at Lucas Cranach the Elder, the Northern Renaissance German artist. But this is Picasso's dialogue with Cranach. And
we talked about this too, that he actually called them dialogues. So when he's deliberately engaging with an artist or a work from the past, at some point he starts, referring to that as his dialogues. And I think that's so interesting because, of course, a lot of museums do that programmatically now. They will commission artists to have a dialogue with their collection or with, past work in a contemporary way. And of course, all artists, I think, see themselves as part of the continuum, and are often, their work is often in conversation with the past, but he was very clear about it. He called them dialogues.
Here's the dove
Mhm.
in flight, which is so graceful.
It's a beautiful sight line. Another reason to come to the museum is to stand in the hallway and look down the hallway and see that dove as part of the sight line is really quite striking. And it was kind of accidental that happened. It was for the wall, not necessarily for the sight line view that dove was moved there. This is one where if you look at it, and we had a conversation about this last week, it's a drawing, but it's a drawing without contour lines in a way. It's like he has made marks that coalesce. They kind of conjure this dove. It's pretty spectacular. Of course, it is really accessible subject matter, a dove, particularly this time of year. It's been a symbol of peace for millennia. And his daughter was named Paloma too, so particularly personally meaningful to Picasso. But it is pretty much a tour de force of sort of graphic ability.
Yes. And Picasso had been working with the image of the dove in the late 40s, and he even used one for the poster for the World Communist Congress for Supporters of Peace. Picasso was a self-professed communist, though some of his peers joked and said he wasn't a communist at all, actually. Even though
All those shoes he made, I don't know.
yes.
He's a kind of a capitalist.
And then we come, as we're coming out of the lithographs, he begins to create linocuts, again, creating friction because he ends his relationship with Françoise Gillot when he meets Jacqueline Roch, whom he marries in 1961. And Jacqueline, he becomes obsessed with her image. This is among my favorites in the exhibition, profile bust.
It's really powerful. I was in there this afternoon. Like I said, a journalist was in today. And it's funny, the disproportion, the incredible enlargement of the eye is actually really, really powerful.
It indeed is. And then he worked in numerous states again. So the one that we have in the show is this one. And then he works through it, where he shows the outlines of her hair. And then he comes to this one here, which is very similar to that one, but he darkens. It's like as if a light is filtered or covered up on a window of Jacqueline. And I should mention that Jacqueline is the only one of Picasso's partners whom he allows to watch him work in the studio. She sees his vulnerabilities, his mistakes, his weaknesses. She speaks Spanish to him. She learns Spanish, even though she's French. She enjoyed a particular place.
It's a tragic story, though, right? Because she really is maybe more of a partner to him than some of the other women, and is very involved in his work and very involved in his access to Picasso and his persona. But she commits suicide after his death, right? It's like she almost felt her work was done.
Yes. She committed suicide in 1986, like Marie-Thérèse Walter, who committed suicide in 1977. And then one of Picasso's grandsons, I believe, there may have been a son in there, but it was a grandson, also committed suicide. There are a number of suicides with people.
A path of tragedy.
Yes. In family members or partners.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's that the destructiveness of we had conversations about this. I mean, we really were trying to deal with this honestly, and talking about the what happens when people are repeatedly victimized and become sort of acclimated to the circumstances of their lives and don't resist, and how living within that is living within abuse, even when it's emotional trauma.
Now here is a very strong example of his line of cut printmaking. In the photographs here, Picasso begins to experiment with it. He actually, as you can see here, is using the shower. And he did this process to create the nocturnal dance with an owl. Over here, where you start to have drippings running of the ink, and he's doing it deliberately. There he is rinsing. See? And I
Yeah,
believe
I'm really glad you found you integrated these process pictures, because they really do show how much the hand of the artist is involved in making these.
there he is with Hidalgo Arnero in the bathroom working out these images. It's fascinating to watch, to see how he worked. And that's the line, one of the linoleum block cuts and the press. So when you come to the show,
I was gonna say, is there anything else we should make sure to put on screen quickly before we wrap up? This is a great one. That was
yeah, we definitely we want to show this, and then one of the of his last pieces we'll show.
Okay.
Very late ones. Oh, not that one. Was yes, a variation on Manet's Luncheon on the Grass.
It's so interesting to think of taking, of course, Manet being a provocative, disruptive artistic force in his own day, putting this nude woman into this composition, is audacious. But then Picasso, abstracting it into these forms is similarly audacious. We can see elements of Déjeuner sur l'herbe in here, but it's all kind of been remixed.
It has. We have the male figure here is on the left, but with a woman, one of the women is almost jumping up in an aggressive manner here. Mm-hmm. It's completely reworked, and then he did it again here in another line of cut, the same motif, but it's quite different. So in terms of something to wrap everything up, do not, when you come, don't miss the 6, Head of a Woman with a Hat, where Jacqueline comes back, because you get to see what he does from the beginning image all the way to the finished one. We have them arranged this way so you can see the progression all the way to the end. And at the end, he collaborates with the Crommelink brothers. And here's a great photograph of Picasso going over changes with them. And with the Crommelinks, he returns to etchings. And here is a series of illustrations he did based upon the Spanish author from the Renaissance, Rojas, a story with a character named Celestine or Celestina. And Picasso reinvents Rojas' story. And he inserts himself here, old and nude, with the old procuress at his right, and makes it a
where
tale.
The Picasso without a shirt on comes back in.
Yes, there he is.
So often photographed that way.
And very different here, conducting business with the 2 Crommelink brothers, looking at the prints. And at this stage, Picasso has established his studio, and the workshop for the Crommelinks is right next door.
It's very handy. I mean, one of the things that you talk about in labels and texts is sometimes the cumbersomeness when he is in the country of sending plates or materials back and forth to Paris to be printed, or to get the materials he needs delivered, plates to work, etc. So they were smart entrepreneurs to set up shop near Picasso.
Yes.
All right. I wonder, for those of you who have stuck with us, we've got some folks still online. If anybody has any questions, speak now, or forever hold your peace, or type it in chat, or make a comment on Facebook, and I might see it. Otherwise, I'm gonna wrap up with a few comments here. Thanks everybody for being with us. It's always really fun for Daniel and I to just, sit and talk together and share some behind the scenes and some new insights with everyone when we do Let's Talk Art. And I will say, if you're local, if you're in the area, tomorrow night we're open till 8. It's one of our December Fridays, and we're doing mulled wine. So I can invite anyone over 21 who's listening to stop by the museum for a drink tomorrow. So come on over, and we might see you tomorrow. And we're doing a couple tours of the exhibition, I think, as part of the evening. And we have charcuterie and mulled wine, as I mentioned. So hope everyone is enjoying the holiday season thus far. And last but not least, I will say, please remember the museum in your year-end giving. I know a lot of wonderfully worthy causes are all trying to get annual donations at this time of year, but if you love what we do, if you enjoy it yourself, if you know what we do for the community, I would encourage you to please make a donation to us. And if you're not a museum member, join the family, become a member of the museum. We would love to have you, and we're friendly people. It's a good place to be associated with, if
Definitely.
I do say so myself.
It certainly is. And we also encourage you to see our other special exhibition, Childhood Favorites, 100 Years of Children's Book Illustration. And there will be the next Let's Talk Art will focus on that show.
Okay. And I'll just share, because we have folks on Facebook, we have some comments. Thank you. We'll be driving to Hagerstown to see the show. Love learning the context for the show. And we had a colleague ask if there was a work we wanted, but we weren't able to get. Excuse me, but it's a traveling collection. So we took it as is. I think we did get one surprise piece we didn't know we were getting.
Yes, that's right. There were 1 or 2 prints that were not on the original list. And that was a nice surprise. The woman
and they are large. I mean, the exhibition, most of the works are large scale works. And so it's a pretty, large installation when you bring them all together. And at one point we changed our sort of the way we thought we would hang the show, because we wanted the works to have more space. So we created the gallery guide because we wanted less text on the wall and more space for artwork on the wall. And there it is. Good work, Daniel.
Thank you.
And Sarah Wolf, who does our in-house graphic design and our exhibition design. So anyway, thanks a lot for being with us, everybody, tonight. And we will see you. The next Let's Talk Art is going to be in February.
Yes.
Is that right? And I think it's going to be about Childhood Favorites, the Children's Book Illustration Show, and Sarah Wolf will be joining Daniel to talk about that. And that should be a lot of fun. So take care, everybody.
Thank you. Take good care. Happy holidays.